The Battle of Kursk, fought between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in the summer of 1943, was one of the largest and most decisive battles of World War II. The battle, which took place from July 5 to August 23, 1943, in the Soviet Union near the city of Kursk, marked a major turning point in the war on the Eastern Front. It was the culmination of Germany's last significant offensive in the East and a decisive Soviet counteroffensive that significantly weakened the Wehrmacht's ability to launch further large-scale operations against the Soviet Union. The strategic context. The Battle of Kursk occurred after the failure of Germany's Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, which began in 1941. By 1943, the tide of the war had turned in favor of the Soviets, especially after their victory at the Battle of Stalingrad in early 1943. However, Adolf Hitler's ambitions of defeating the Soviet Union remained, and he hoped a major offensive in the Kursk salient, a bulge in the Soviet lines, would break the Soviet defensive position and turn the momentum back in favor of Nazi Germany. The Germans planned to launch Operation Citadel, an assault on the Kursk salient with a force of over 900,000 soldiers, 2,700 tanks, and 1,000 aircraft. Their goal was to encircle and destroy the Soviet forces in the area and reclaim the initiative in the war. On the other hand, the Soviet Union had already been preparing for the attack. The Soviets, under the leadership of Marshal Georgy Zhukov, used the time to construct an extensive system of defensive fortifications, including anti-tank ditches, minefields, and trenches, designed to repel the German assault. The German offensive. The Germans launched their offensive on July 5, 1943, but encountered strong Soviet defenses that slowed their progress. The Germans initially gained some ground, but the Soviet defensive lines proved much more formidable than anticipated. The panzer divisions of Germany's Army Group Center and Army Group South were bogged down by well-organized Soviet defenses, and the Germans struggled with supply issues and fierce resistance. The Germans also faced significant logistical problems as they were unable to maintain momentum. The Soviets had carefully prepared counterattacks, waiting for the Germans to overextend. The Soviets used their knowledge of the terrain and their own numerical advantage to disrupt the German advance. The Soviet counteroffensive. The real turning point came after the initial German assaults had lost momentum. On July 12, the Soviets launched Operation Kutuzov, a counteroffensive designed to strike the German flanks while the Germans were still concentrated on the salient. The Soviet forces encircled large numbers of German troops and began to recapture key positions. Soviet forces also launched a second counteroffensive in the south, known as Operation Polkovodets-Rumyantsev, which further pushed the Germans back and put additional pressure on their already overstretched forces. As the battle dragged on, the Germans found themselves unable to achieve their original objectives. They failed to break through the Soviet defensive lines, and the Soviets inflicted significant losses on the German forces. The battle's outcome was a decisive Soviet victory. Significance of the battle. The Battle of Kursk was a watershed moment in World War II for several reasons. End of German offensive capability. The failure of Operation Citadel marked the end of Germany's ability to launch large-scale offensives on the Eastern Front. The Germans were forced into a defensive posture, and the Soviet victory at Kursk allowed the Red Army to gain the strategic initiative. The first major tank battle. The battle featured the largest tank battle in history, with over 6,000 tanks involved. The Germans and Soviets fought with their most advanced armored vehicles, including the German Tiger and Panther tanks and the Soviet T-34 and KV tanks. Despite the superiority of German tanks in some respects, the Soviet ability to mass-produce tanks and effectively use them in battle proved decisive. Boost to Soviet morale. The victory at Kursk gave the Soviet Union a much-needed morale boost. It showed that the Red Army could not only hold its ground but also successfully counterattack. Following the battle, the Soviets began a series of successful offensives that would push German forces westward, culminating in the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany in 1945. A shift in World War II. Kursk is often considered the last major German offensive on the Eastern Front. After the battle, the Germans were forced to fight a series of retreating defensive actions. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union gained the upper hand, gradually liberating occupied territories and advancing toward Germany. Conclusion: the Battle of Kursk was a decisive and pivotal event in World War II, marking the shift from German offensives to Soviet offensives on the Eastern Front. The Soviet victory not only crippled the Wehrmacht's ability to fight effectively in the East, but also established the Red Army's dominance, setting the stage for the eventual Soviet victory in the war. The battle's massive scale, the innovative use of tank warfare, and the strategic importance of the German defeat made Kursk a turning point in the conflict, shaping the future of the war and the eventual downfall of Nazi Germany.